I left my ring under a coffee mug and walked out before she woke up. She thought I was at work. I was already on another continent. 19 years invisible in my own house. And 1 year of planning was all it took to disappear completely. She had no idea what I'd built while she wasn't looking. My name is Gregory Crane. I'm 49 years old. I spent 21 years as a financial controller for a mid-sized construction holding company in Columbus, Ohio. I knew numbers the way some men know engines. Intuitively, completely. I could find a discrepancy in a 400-page audit report the same way a hound dog finds a scent. That skill paid for our house, our vacations, our son's college tuition. And for 19 years, it paid for a marriage that only one of us was actually in. Claudia was beautiful when I met her. Sharp, funny, the kind of woman who fills a room without trying. I fell hard and fast, and I won't pretend otherwise. We married young and built something real, or at least I thought we did. Owen came along when we were both still figuring things out, and for a while, the three of us felt like an actual family. But somewhere around year 8, Claudia stopped seeing me. I don't mean that poetically. I mean she literally stopped registering my presence. I'd walk into a room, and she'd keep talking on the phone. I'd mention something important, and she'd respond to something I hadn't said. After a while, you stop talking, because talking in an empty space was a man down to nothing. I want to be straight with you. I'm not writing this to make her look bad. I'm writing it because I know there are men out there right now sitting across the dinner table from someone who doesn't see them, and they're wondering if they're crazy. You're not crazy. You're just invisible. And invisible men eventually disappear. I spent 14 months preparing. Not on impulse, not out of spite, with the same precision I applied to every audit I ever ran. I documented everything. I liquidated carefully, moved funds in amounts small enough to avoid notice, established a trust in Owen's name that Claudia couldn't touch. I researched. I planned. I waited. The morning I left, it was 4:47 a.m. Still dark outside. I'd already loaded the car the night before, moving things in gradual trips over 2 weeks, so nothing looked sudden. One bag remained. My work bag, the one I carried every day for 19 years, now packed with everything that mattered. I set the keys on the kitchen table. House key, car key, mailbox key, all lined up straight, the way I always kept things. My wedding ring went under my coffee mug. I stood there for exactly 1 minute, looking at the kitchen I'd redesigned after the flood in 2019, the counters I'd chosen, the cabinet hardware I'd installed myself on a Saturday she spent at brunch with her friends. Then I walked out, loaded the last bag, and drove to Port Columbus. She would wake up around 7:15, make herself coffee because I wasn't there to make it, and assume I'd left early for a site visit. That was the story the calendar showed, an early meeting in Cincinnati. She wouldn't think twice. By the time she brewed that coffee, I was already through security. And by the time she called my phone, which rang twice before going silent forever, I was on a plane. Not to Cincinnati, not to another state, to another continent. She assumed it was just another workday. She had no idea it was the last one. The flight landed in Frankfurt at 6:40 in the morning, local time. I sat in the terminal for 2 hours, drank bad coffee, and watched businessmen in suits moving through the concourse like they had somewhere important to be. I used to be one of them. That morning, I was nobody, and nobody felt like freedom. I wasn't staying in Germany. Frankfurt was a layover, a clean break in the trail. From there, I flew to Lisbon, where I had a furnished apartment reserved under a name I'd been quietly building for 14 months, Alan Marsh. Not flashy, not memorable, just a name that fit a quiet man who paid cash and asked nothing of anyone. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building near the Alfama district. Small, clean, one window overlooking a tiled rooftop. I sat on the edge of the single bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Not out of sadness, out of the strange, disorienting feeling of having actually done the thing you planned for over a year. I gave myself 1 week to breathe. Then I got to work. Back in Columbus, I'd spent the last 8 months quietly restructuring my financial footprint. My salary had been direct deposited into our joint account for 19 years, until 14 months ago, when I opened a separate account at a regional bank Claudia had never heard of. The increases I'd received over the past 3 years, I rerouted there. Small enough adjustments that the joint balance stayed consistent. She never looked at the statements closely enough to notice. I also established a trust in Owen's name. Not through our family attorney, through a firm in Cincinnati I'd never used before. The trust held a significant portion of my personal savings. Claudia's name was nowhere on it. Owen didn't know about it yet. That was intentional. I needed him to find out on his own terms, not through me, and not through her. The apartment in Lisbon was a starting point, not a destination. I had no intention of staying in Europe permanently. But I needed distance, real distance, the kind that can't be driven across in a weekend. While I let everything settle and watched how Claudia responded. And she responded fast. On day 4, I checked a secondary email account I'd set up specifically for monitoring. A legal notification service I'd subscribed to flagged activity on our joint mortgage, an inquiry from a third-party lender. She was trying to pull credit against the house. The application stalled when the lender couldn't reach me for cosigner verification. On day 6, the same service flagged something else, a credit inquiry under my Social Security number from a lending institution in Columbus. She tried to open a new line of credit in my name. I sat with that for a while. Not surprised. I'd anticipated it. That's why, 3 months before I left, I placed a security freeze on my credit file with all 3 bureaus. The application was denied within 48 hours. She was already trying to use my name like a tool, like she always had. I thought about Owen during those first days more than I thought about anything else. He was 25, living in Denver, working for an engineering firm. We had a decent relationship. Not as close as I'd wanted, but solid. Honest. A few weeks before I left, I'd driven up to Columbus from a site visit and called him on the way home. We talked for an hour. I didn't tell him what I was planning. But before I hung up, I said, whatever happens, I need you to know I'm proud of you. And I'll always be reachable if you need me. He'd gone quiet for a second. Then, that sounds like a goodbye, Dad. Just saying what I should have said more often. I told him. He didn't push. That was Owen. He always knew when not to push. I left an envelope for him with a contact address. Sealed. Dated. Instructions to open it in 1 year. He had it sitting in a drawer in Denver, waiting. Whatever came next, I needed him to understand it in his own time. Not through her version of events. Not through the story she was already constructing. His version had to come from a truth. Claudia wasn't the type to fall apart quietly. I knew that going in. She was a woman who processed shock through action. Fast, aggressive, sometimes reckless. So when I monitored the first wave of her response from a cafe in Lisbon, I wasn't surprised by the speed. I was surprised by the order of things. She didn't call the police first. She called her attorney. That told me everything I needed to know about how she'd framed this in her own mind. Not a missing husband. Not a family emergency. A legal situation. By day 4, she'd already contacted our bank. The joint checking account was frozen pending a spousal dispute filing. That was fine. I hadn't touched that account in 8 months. What she found when she dug deeper was something else entirely. The secondary mortgage on the house had been paid off in full. Not recently, but 3 years earlier, from an account she'd never seen before. She'd been making monthly payments toward a balance that no longer existed, and the overpayments had been accumulating in escrow. I knew the moment she found it, because the monitoring service flagged a request from a Columbus law firm for mortgage documentation going back 5 years. Her attorney was already building a paper trail. What Claudia didn't find, what she couldn't find, was the trust. I'd structured it carefully, through a Cincinnati firm with no digital overlap to anything connected to our marriage. The trust held Owen's name. It was clean, legal, and entirely outside her reach. When her attorney eventually sent a demand letter to our family lawyer requesting a full accounting of marital assets, the trust wasn't listed. Because technically, it wasn't a marital asset. It never had been. She tried the credit line next. The application came back denied within 24 hours. My freeze held. Then she tried something I hadn't fully anticipated. She went to my employer. The call came in on day 8. My director at the construction holding company received a message from Claudia asking whether I'd been placed on any kind of extended leave, whether my position was still active, and whether there were any concerns about my mental state. She framed it as a welfare check. She framed everything as something it wasn't. My director, a straightforward man named Pete Callahan, who'd worked with me for 11 years, told her that my employment status was confidential and that she should direct any legal inquiries through proper channels. Then he called the emergency contact number I'd left in my personnel file 2 months before I left. It routed to a secondary phone I monitored from Lisbon. I didn't call back, but I noted it. What happened next was the part that genuinely caught me off guard. On day 11, Owen called Claudia, not because she'd reached out to him, because a mutual family friend had told him his father hadn't been seen in nearly 2 weeks. Owen called his mother. She gave him her version. All of it. The full performance. By day 12, Owen left 3 voicemails on my old number, which was already disconnected, and one on a secondary line I'd given him years ago for emergencies. That one I answered. His voice was controlled but tight. "Dad, I need to know you're okay. Just tell me you're okay." "I'm okay," I said. "I'm more okay than I've been in years." Silence. Then, "She says you had some kind of breakdown." "I know what she says." I told him. "I need you to hold on to that envelope I asked you to keep. Don't open it yet. Just hold it." "Dad." "Owen." I kept my voice steady, even the way I used to talk him through hard things when he was a kid. I didn't break down. I made a decision. There's a difference. You'll understand everything when the time comes. Right now, I need you to trust me the way I've always trusted you." Another silence. Longer this time. "Okay," he finally said. "But you call me. You call me every 2 weeks minimum." "Deal." "Deal," I said. I hung up and sat at the small table by the window in Lisbon, watching the light move across the rooftops. Owen was steady. He was holding. Whatever Claudia was telling him, he wasn't swallowing it whole, because he knew me. He'd always known me better than she did. That was the thing about being invisible for 19 years. The people who actually looked, really looked, they saw everything. I want to be precise about something. Owen didn't choose sides. Not right away. That would have been too easy, and Owen was never easy. He was methodical, like me, the kind of young man who needed to understand a situation fully before he committed to a position. Claudia had always read that as coldness. I read it as integrity. After our phone call, he went quiet for about 10 days. No calls to me, no messages. I didn't push. I knew he was processing, talking to people, weighing things. I'd raised him to think before he reacted, and he was doing exactly that. What I didn't know, what I found out much later, was what he discovered in that 10-day window. Claudia had pressured him to come home to Columbus. She'd leaned on him with everything she had, the worry, the loneliness, the suggestion that his father might be in some kind of mental crisis. She knew how to pull on Owen's sense of responsibility. She'd been practicing that particular technique since he was a teenager. Owen flew to Columbus on day 17. He stayed 3 days. On the second day, he was going through some paperwork in the home office, looking for the car insurance document Claudia claimed she couldn't find, when he opened the wrong drawer. Inside was a folder that had been sitting there, apparently untouched, for years. Inside the folder were printed email exchanges, dated, detailed, between Claudia and a man named Derek Forsyth, going back almost 6 years. Derek Forsyth was not a colleague. He was not a friend. The emails made that clear within the first page. Owen told me about this months later, and the way he described it, his voice flat, his words precise, told me he'd had to work very hard to stay composed in that moment. He hadn't confronted his mother. He'd quietly photographed every page with his phone, replaced the folder exactly as he'd found it, and finished looking for the insurance documents. He flew back to Denver the next morning without saying a word to Claudia about what he'd found. He called me that afternoon. "Dad," he said, "I found something." I listened without interrupting. He walked me through it methodically, the dates, the names, the content. When he finished, there was a long pause on the line. "I need to ask you something," Owen said. "Did you know?" "Not specifically." I told him honestly. But I knew something was wrong for a long time. I just couldn't prove it, and honestly, by the time I would have, it wouldn't have changed the decision. "It changes things for me," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry you're the one who found it." "Don't apologize for her," he said. The edge in his voice was clean and controlled. "That's not yours to carry." That was the moment I knew Owen wasn't just holding. He was standing, fully, clearly, on the side of the truth. Not my side. Not her side. The truth side. That was exactly how I'd raised him, and hearing it from him at 25, in a situation this hard, made me more proud of him than any degree or job ever had. What Owen did next was something I hadn't asked for and wouldn't have predicted. He contacted an attorney in Denver, independently, on his own, and had the photographs of those documents properly preserved as potential legal evidence. No drama, No announcement. Just a quiet, methodical step taken by a young man who understood that facts needed protecting. He called Claudia 2 days later and told her he was busy with work and couldn't come back to Columbus for the foreseeable future. She cried. He listened. He didn't change his answer. When he called me afterward, he sounded tired but solid. The envelope, he said. Can I open it now? Give it 2 more months, I told him. There's a reason for the timing. He exhaled slowly. You planned this down to the last detail, didn't you? Every audit has a closing procedure, I said. He actually laughed at that. A real laugh. Short, surprised, genuine. It was the best sound I'd heard in years. Claudia hired Walt Riker on day 19. I found out about it through a notification from the Legal Monitoring Service. A background inquiry had been filed under my name through a licensed private investigations firm based in Columbus. The firm was small, 3 operatives, but their digital footprint suggested they were competent. Not flashy. Methodical. The kind of outfit that didn't promise miracles but delivered results. Walt Riker was 50 years old, former county sheriff's investigator, 13 years in private practice. I'd actually anticipated this move. When you disappear the way I did, quietly, completely, with no emotional outburst to give people something obvious to chase, the natural response is to hire someone who finds people for a living. I prepared for it. What I hadn't fully prepared for was what Riker would do when he found me. He was good. I'll give him that. Within 3 weeks, he'd eliminated the obvious dead ends. No domestic flights, no hotel bookings, no credit activity, no social media resurrection. He pulled my employment history, my known associates, my professional network. He talked to Pete Callahan at the construction company, who gave him nothing useful. He talked to 2 former colleagues who hadn't heard from me. He talked to a neighbor who said I'd seemed fine the last time she'd seen me. Then he did something smart. He went looking for the things I cared about rather than the things I'd left behind. My professional history was public enough. Financial controller, construction industry, systems-oriented, detail-driven. He started cross-referencing those characteristics with business registrations in rural and mid-sized markets across the country, looking for a cash-purchased ownership stake in something that fit my skill set. He narrowed it to industries with high cash volume: automotive, logistics, small manufacturing. It took him 6 weeks, but he found the trail. A partial ownership transfer, 40% stake, cash transaction, in a small diagnostics and systems consultancy outside of Boise, Idaho. Filed under the name Alan Marsh. The filing date lined up. The transaction size was consistent with what I'd had available, and the business category fit me exactly. He flew to Boise. He found me on a Wednesday morning, standing in the parking lot of the consultancy, reviewing a delivery manifest with one of the technicians. He didn't approach me directly. He sat in a rental car across the street for 40 minutes, confirmed it was me, photographed the exterior of the building, and drove back to his hotel. That evening, he did something I did not expect. He called me. Not Claudia. Me. On the secondary business line, registered to the consultancy. He'd found it in the filing documents. Mr. Marsh, he said when I picked up. Or I suppose I should say Mr. Crane. I didn't respond immediately. I walked out of the back office and into the empty parking lot, letting the quiet of the Idaho evenings settle around me. What do you want? I said. I want to tell you that I found you, Riker said, and that I'm trying to decide what to do about it. That wasn't what I'd expected. You were hired to find me and report back. I was hired to locate you, he said carefully. The report is my call. A pause. I've been doing this for 13 years. I know what a man running from a breakdown looks like. This isn't that. I waited. I went through the financials your wife provided me to establish a baseline, he continued. The trust. The mortgage payoff. The credit freeze. That's not a man who snapped. That's a man who spent over a year building a door and then walked through it. Another pause. I've been through a divorce myself. Nasty one. I know what it looks like when one person has been carrying everything and the other one's been spending it. I stood in the parking lot for a long moment, looking up at the sky over the Boise foothills. Big sky. No noise. What are you going to tell her? I asked. That I found evidence of possible activity in the Pacific Northwest region, he said. Inconclusive. Requires further investigation. I'll bill her for 2 more weeks and give her nothing useful. What? Because my job is to find people, Riker said, not to decide what happens to them after. And something tells me you've already decided that for yourself. He hung up. I stood there a while longer, breathing the cold evening air. Then I went back inside and finished reviewing the manifest. 2 weeks later, Claudia received Riker's inconclusive report and promptly hired a second investigator. I found out about that one 3 days later. This second man, younger, more aggressive, no former law enforcement background, started digging from a different angle. Not my professional history, Claudia's. And what he found, there was something she absolutely had not anticipated him finding. The report landed in my monitoring inbox on a Friday afternoon. Financial activity flagged in Claudia's personal accounts going back 4 years. A series of transfers to a holding entity she'd established without my knowledge. The amounts were substantial. The timing corresponded to a period when our joint savings had been quietly declining in ways I'd noticed, but hadn't been able to fully account for. She'd been moving money out of our marriage for years, and now someone she'd hired had accidentally proven it. The second investigator's name was Craig Dillon. Mid-30s, sharp, the kind of man who dug wide rather than deep, and sometimes turned up things his clients hadn't asked him to find. Claudia had hired him to pick up where Riker left off, find Gregory Crane, confirm location, build a dossier that her attorney could use in divorce proceedings. What Dillon found instead was a 6-year paper trail that led straight back to her. He'd been running a standard financial background on me, pulling every account association, every registered entity, every address history, when he hit an anomaly. A joint account Claudia and I had held at a regional bank had shown consistent withdrawals over a 4-year period, always on the 3rd week of the month, always in amounts just below the reporting threshold. The destination, a single-member LLC registered in Claudia's maiden name, established 6 years ago in the state of Delaware. Dillon flagged it because it was unusual. He wasn't trying to expose his client. He just followed the thread the way any competent investigator would. The LLC had a registered agent, but no public business activity, no website, no filings, no apparent commercial function. What it did have was a bank account, and that account had received just over $190,000 over 4 years. Dillon, to his credit, brought it to Claudia directly before putting it in any written report. He told her what he'd found and asked her to clarify. She told him to drop it, that it was a personal financial matter unrelated to the investigation, and that she only needed him focused on finding me. He dropped it from the official report, but he kept his notes. And somehow, I still don't know the exact mechanism, though I have my suspicions about Riker. Those notes made their way to my monitoring services attorney contact in Columbus within 10 days. I read the summary on a Tuesday morning in Boise with a coffee going cold beside me. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to the attorney I'd retained in Cincinnati, the same one who'd structured Owen's trust, with a single instruction: preserve this and determine what it means for any future proceedings. The attorney called me back within 2 hours. His assessment was direct. If Claudia initiated divorce proceedings and attempted to claim a share of the Allen Marsh business assets on grounds that startup capital derived from marital funds, this documentation would be the counterweight. It wouldn't just neutralize her claim. It would potentially expose her to a civil recovery action for the $190,000. She built herself a problem, he said. She's been building it for 6 years, I told him. She just didn't think anyone would ever look. I called Owen that evening. I didn't give him every detail. He didn't need the financial specifics yet. But I told him that things were developing on the legal side, and that when the time came to open the envelope, the picture would be clearer than either of us had expected. He was quiet for a moment. She's been taking money. It appears so. For how long? At least 4 years. Possibly longer. A long exhale on his end. That's why the savings never grew the way they should have. I remember asking you about that once, and you said you'd been looking into it. I had been, I said. I just couldn't source it cleanly at the time. And now someone she hired did it for her. He let out a short, humorless breath. Dad, that's almost poetic. Almost, I agreed. Owen went quiet again for a moment, and when he spoke next, his voice had that same flat, controlled quality it got when he'd made a decision and locked it in. I'm going to call the Denver attorney again, the one who preserved the emails. I want him talking to your Cincinnati guy. Owen, I'm not asking for permission, he said evenly. I'm telling you what I'm doing. You spent 19 years being careful and methodical, so she didn't see it coming. Let me do the same. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. He was right. I sat back in the chair in my Boise office, small desk, single window looking out over the flat western landscape, and thought about the strange geometry of how things unfold. You spend years watching money disappear and being unable to prove it. You spend 14 months building an exit, and then the woman who drove you out hires someone who accidentally hands you everything you needed. That's the thing about people who cut corners and hide things. They tend to assume everyone around them is doing the same. They don't account for the man who kept every receipt and documented every discrepancy and simply waited until the math told the whole story. The math was talking now, loud and clear. Boise wasn't a city I'd ever imagined building a life in. But that's the thing about starting over. You don't always choose the place, so much as the place reveals itself as the right fit. The high desert landscape, the wide streets, the no-nonsense culture of people who built things with their hands and didn't spend a lot of time performing for each other. It suited me in ways Columbus never had. The consultancy had grown faster than I projected. 18 months in, I had 3 full-time staff, a roster of 12 regular clients in construction, logistics, and light manufacturing, and a reputation in the regional business community as the firm that found the problems nobody else wanted to admit existed. I'd built it on the same principle I'd applied to every audit I'd ever run. Follow the numbers. Tell the truth. Don't flinch when the answer is uncomfortable. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that. Loretta Voss came in on a Thursday afternoon in February as a referral from one of my logistics clients. She ran a mid-sized landscaping and grounds management company, 12 employees, 3 commercial contracts with the city, and a bookkeeping situation that her accountant had apparently been mismanaging for 2 years. She sat across the desk from me, 46 years old, steady-eyed, and laid out her financials with a directness that I appreciated immediately. No hedging, no excuses. Just, here's the problem, here's what I know, here's what I don't. We spent 2 hours going through her books. I found 4 separate misclassifications and 1 recurring error that had been inflating her liability column for 18 months. She sat across from me while I walked through it, asked precise questions, and didn't once try to make the meeting about anything other than the numbers in front of us. When we were done, she stood, shook my hand, and said, "You're the first person I've paid in 2 years who actually told me something true." She left. I went back to work. She came back 3 weeks later, not as a client, but with a referral. A friend of hers who owned a small manufacturing operation and needed the same kind of analysis. She dropped off the contact information, declined coffee, and was back out the door in 4 minutes. The third time she came in, 6 weeks after the first meeting, she sat down without being invited to and said, "I'm going to ask you to dinner. You can say no, but I'd rather ask than wonder." I looked at her for a moment. "I have a complicated situation," I said. "Everyone over 40 has a complicated situation," she said evenly. "I'm not asking for your whole story. I'm asking for dinner." Her directness was the thing that got me. Not performance, not strategy, just a person who said what she meant and meant what she said. I'd forgotten that was possible. We had dinner at a place she knew near the river. We talked for 3 hours about work, about Boise, about the things that had brought each of us to this particular point. She'd been widowed 4 years earlier. Her husband, a contractor, had died of a sudden cardiac event at 51. She'd rebuilt her business and her life with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to my office, and she talked about it without asking for sympathy. I told her I was in the middle of a legal situation involving a previous marriage. I didn't give her details. She didn't ask for them. "I'm not in a hurry," she said simply, "and I don't do drama." I believed her. We saw each other twice more before I told Owen. He took it carefully, not coldly, but thoughtfully, the way he took everything. His main question was whether she knew the full situation. "She knows enough," I told him. "Does she know your real name?" "Yes," I said. "She's known for about 3 weeks." A pause. "How'd she take it?" She said, "I figured something was complicated. That's more manageable than most things I've dealt with." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "I like her already." I hadn't expected that to mean as much as it did. But Owen's steadiness, his willingness to extend trust where he judged it was earned, was one of the things about him that consistently reminded me I'd done at least one thing right in 19 years. Claudia found out about Loretta 4 months later, through a mutual connection in the Columbus business community who'd somehow heard a second-hand mention of my situation. The call she made to Owen that evening. According to Owen, who called me immediately afterward, lasted 22 minutes and involved a significant amount of volume. Owen listened to all of it. Then he said quietly, "Mom, he left. That was his decision to make. What he does with his life after that is his business." She told him he was being disloyal. He told her he was being accurate. Then he hung up and called me. "She knows about Loretta," he said. "I figure it was coming." "You okay?" "More than okay," I said. "Good," Owen said. And I could hear in his voice, steady, certain, unmoved by Claudia's performance, that he meant it. The letter arrived at the consultancy's registered address in Boise on a Monday morning in early spring. Clean white envelope, law firm letterhead out of Columbus, Ohio. I recognized the firm. Claudia had used them before for a minor contract dispute 3 years into our marriage. They were not small time. I opened it at my desk with coffee going cold beside me and read it twice. Claudia, through her attorneys, was filing a civil action claiming that the startup capital used to establish my Boise consultancy, approximately $180,000, constituted marital assets that had been misappropriated prior to separation. She was seeking recovery of that amount plus a 40% stake in the current business valuation, which her attorneys had estimated, aggressively and incorrectly, at $740,000. She was also seeking attorney's fees. I set the letter down, finished my coffee, and called my Cincinnati attorney. He'd been expecting something like this. We'd been building the response for months, documentation of every source account used to fund the startup, tracing each dollar back to its origin with timestamps and bank records. The money had come from my separate account, funded entirely by salary increases and bonuses routed away from the joint account over 14 months. None of it was marital property under Ohio law, and we could prove it to the penny. But Claudia's attorneys had a second angle, and that one required a different response. They were also moving to have Alan Marsh legally identified as Gregory Crane, citing fraudulent assumption of identity in a commercial context. This was the sharper edge of the filing. If they could establish that the business had been built under a false identity for the purpose of concealing marital assets, it changed the legal framing significantly. My attorney wasn't rattled. "She's throwing everything at the wall," he said. "The identity argument has limits. You didn't assume a false identity to conceal assets. You assumed it to start a new life, which is not a crime. The startup capital documentation kills the misappropriation claim, and the LLC documentation we have on her makes any aggressive posture on her part a significant risk to herself." "You think she knows about the LLC?" I asked. "Her attorneys might not have told her the full exposure," he said. "People sometimes hire lawyers and assume the lawyers are only looking forward. These ones are also looking at her." The case was filed in Columbus. My attorney moved immediately to transfer a venue to Idaho, where the business was located and where I now resided. The motion was granted 3 weeks later. The hearing date was set for 8 weeks out. I flew to Boise's federal courthouse on a gray October morning and sat at the defense table in a suit I'd bought 2 months earlier. Not flashy, just correct. My attorney sat beside me. Across the aisle, Claudia sat with 2 attorneys and a financial consultant she'd flown in from Columbus. She looked older. Not badly, just like someone who'd been running on anger for 18 months and was starting to feel the weight of it. She didn't look at me directly until the judge called the proceedings to order. Then she turned, briefly, and our eyes met. I held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, steady, neutral, giving her nothing to work with, and then looked back at the bench. The judge was a precise, no-nonsense man named Harlan Briggs who had clearly read every filing in advance and had questions prepared. He moved through them methodically, and my attorney answered each one with documentation already tabbed and ready. When Claudia's lead attorney raised the identity argument, Judge Briggs looked at him over his glasses and said, "Counsel, assuming a pseudonym in a commercial context is not per se fraudulent. You'll need a substantially higher evidentiary threshold than you've presented here to sustain that claim. Do you have additional documentation?" They did not. The misappropriation claim took longer, nearly 2 hours of financial testimony. But when my attorney introduced the source account records, the timestamps, and the salary diversion documentation, Claudia's financial consultant visibly recalculated something on his notepad and leaned toward her lead attorney with a murmured comment. The attorney requested a 15-minute recess. During the recess, I stood in the corridor outside the courtroom and looked out a tall window at the Boise skyline. Owen had flown in that morning and was sitting in the gallery. He hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. Just knowing he was in the room was enough. When we reconvened, Claudia's attorneys withdrew the misappropriation claim. The identity argument was dismissed for insufficient evidence. The remaining procedural matters were resolved in 40 minutes. Judge Briggs closed the proceedings with a comment that I noted carefully. Mr. Crane, the court finds no basis for the claims presented. The documentation provided establishes clear and legal separation of the assets in question. This matter is closed. Claudia's lead attorney immediately filed a notice of intent to appeal. My attorney told me quietly, as we gathered our materials, that the appeal had almost no viable grounds and would likely be withdrawn within 60 days. He was right. It was withdrawn in 47. I walked out of the Boise courthouse in the cold October air, Owen beside me. He didn't say anything for half a block. Then he put a hand briefly on my shoulder, one firm, solid grip, and let go. That said everything either of us needed. 18 months after the Boise courthouse, a business journal reached out to me through the consultancy's public contact form. They were doing a feature on financial systems consultancies that had scaled quickly in secondary markets, smaller cities, away from the coastal hubs, and someone had recommended Alan Marsh Consulting as a case worth profiling. I thought about it for 2 days before agreeing. Part of me was still cautious. Old reflex. But Claudia's appeal had been withdrawn. The legal matter was closed. Owen knew everything. Loretta knew everything. I'd been living as myself. My actual self, not a performance of someone safe and invisible, for over a year now. Staying hidden from a threat that no longer existed wasn't caution. It was just a habit I needed to break. The journalist was professional and thorough. The piece ran 4 months later in a regional business publication that covered the Mountain West. 2 photographs, one of the exterior of the consultancy building, one of me at my desk reviewing a systems diagram. The headline was straightforward, built on accuracy, how one consultant turned financial precision into a regional practice. They used Alan Marsh throughout. That was fine. The name had earned its own weight by then. I didn't think much about what happened next. I probably should have. Owen called me on a Saturday morning, 8 days after the piece ran online. "Dad," he said, and his voice had a particular quality in it. Not alarm, but a careful neutrality that I recognized as the sound of him managing something before he said it out loud. Mom found the article. I set down my coffee. Al, a friend of hers in the Columbus business community. They forwarded it. She called me last night. I waited. "She's not threatening anything legal," he said. "The appeal's done. Her attorney apparently told her there's nothing to file." A pause. "But she wants to see you." She called it. Her word. A conversation. I thought about that for a moment. About Claudia reading the article. About what it would have felt like to see my face in print, under a different name, 2 years after I'd walked out of kitchen in Columbus and left my ring under a coffee mug. About what kind of woman reads that and calls it a conversation instead of a confrontation. "What do you think?" I asked Owen. "I think she's exhausted," he said carefully. "I don't think she's going to cause trouble. I think she finally understands that the approach she's been running hasn't worked and isn't going to." Another pause. "I also think you're the only one who can close this chapter cleanly. For her. For you. Maybe for me too." That last part was what decided it. I called Claudia that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting. The conversation was short. We agreed to meet in Denver, neutral ground, Owen City. He offered his apartment. I appreciated the gesture, but suggested a restaurant instead. Some conversations need exits. We met on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. She looked like herself, put together, controlled. The social armor she'd always worn fitted perfectly in place. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. A tiredness that went deeper than sleeplessness. She didn't perform. That was the thing that surprised me most. She didn't open with accusations or grievances or the version of events she'd been telling her friends. She sat across from me at a quiet corner table and said, "I want to know when I lost you." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "You didn't lose me, Claudia. You stopped looking for me about 10 years ago. There's a difference." She absorbed that. Didn't argue with it. "The emails," she said. "Derek, you knew." "Not specifically. Not until Owen found them. But I knew something had been wrong for a long time." "I'm not going to excuse it," she said. Her voice was flat, factual. I'm not going to explain it either. I just wanted you to know that I know. What I did, what I took, I know. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would have added to it. We sat there for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing important. Owen's work, the Denver Spring, the consultancy. When she stood to leave, she straightened her coat with the same precise gesture she'd always had. And for a second, she looked exactly like the woman I'd married. Are you happy? She asked. Yeah, I said. I am. She nodded once. Then she walked out. Owen was waiting at the bar near the entrance. He'd been there the whole time, far enough away to give us space, but close enough if things had gone differently. He watched his mother leave, then came over and sat down across from me. How'd it go? He asked. Clean, I said. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then he waved down the server and ordered 2 coffees without asking me if I wanted one. I did. He knew that. 9 months after Denver, Loretta and I drove up into the Sawtooth Mountains on a Saturday in October with no particular plan. Her idea. She'd said the week before, "You've been staring at spreadsheets since Tuesday. We're going somewhere without Wi-Fi." And that was that. We parked at a trailhead outside of Stanley and walked for 3 hours through country that didn't care who either of us had been before we got there. The aspens had turned. The air had the kind of cold clarity that makes you feel like your lungs have been cleaned out and refilled with something better. She didn't talk much on the trail. Neither did I. That was one of the things I'd learned to appreciate about her. She understood that silence between 2 people who trusted each other was not empty. It was just quiet. We stopped at a ridge overlook around noon and sat on a flat rock eating sandwiches she'd packed. Below us, a valley spread out in gold and rust, and the particular hard blue of a high mountain sky. You thinking about anything specific? She asked. No, I said. And it was true. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't running numbers, wasn't tracking a situation, wasn't managing variables. I was just sitting on a rock in Idaho next to a woman who said what she meant, eating a sandwich she'd made because she'd noticed I'd forgotten to eat breakfast. That was it. That was the whole thing. Owen called that evening while we were driving back down the mountain. He'd been made project lead on a major infrastructure assessment in Denver, a significant step, exactly the kind of work he'd been positioning himself for. He told me about it in the same methodical way he approached everything, walking through the scope and the timeline, and I could hear in his voice the specific satisfaction of a man doing work that matched his capabilities. When he finished, he said, "How's Loretta?" "Right here," I said. "Tell her she's good for you," Owen said. I glanced at her. She heard. She smiled at the windshield without looking at me. "He says you're good for me," I told her. "He's perceptive," she said. "Like his father." I hadn't thought about Claudia in 3 weeks. When the thought surfaced now, it came without weight. Not anger, not grief, not the lingering low-grade exhaustion of a man still carrying something he should have put down years ago. She was living in Columbus, as far as I knew. Owen kept minimal contact. The LLC matter had resulted in a separate civil proceeding that her attorneys had settled quietly, with restitution, 6 months after the Boise case closed. The house, our house, the one I'd spent 19 years maintaining, had been sold. Claudia had listed it herself, 8 months after the lawsuit ended. Owen told me the number. It was a fair price. I felt nothing about it either way, which was exactly the right amount to feel. The consultancy had grown to 11 full-time staff and a regional footprint that covered 4 states. We'd been approached twice about acquisition. Both times I declined, both times politely, both times with a clear internal understanding that I wasn't building this to sell it. I was building it because building it was the thing I was good at and the thing that made the days worth getting up for. That was reason enough. We got back to Boise around 8 that evening. Loretta made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, a different table in a different kitchen from the one I'd stood at 3 years earlier at 4:47 in the morning, and looked at the life I'd built piece by piece from a single decision made on a dark October morning in Columbus, Ohio. The keys I'd left on that table hadn't opened anything worth keeping. The ones in my pocket now opened everything that mattered.